Red turn on. We're now streaming. Okay, good. It says we're on. Whoops, let's see. I guess, that's right. The camera is way up high. So we're going to have to lower the camera a little. So how do you lower it exactly? This thing here, I guess. There we go. That's better. Okay, now we're ready. Okay, we'll get started. It's 9:30. It appears to be running, so I guess we're in good shape now. Testing the sound. You got sound on there? Okay, good. I keep forgetting to turn on the microphone, so it's my fault. It looks like it's slightly out of focus, maybe. Okay. All right, well, this is our 28th week in the book of Job, and we're almost at the end of Job's speeches. This is Job's last speech in here. He does speak 2 or 3 more sentences later, but we're coming to the end of his talk. For the first half of the book, Job was under disasters, and he lamented all the disasters, but his friends blamed him, said he had hidden sins, that's why he's being punished. But in chapter 19, the Holy Spirit spoke through Job and cheered him up a bit. Now, he's not entirely cured, as you'll see today. He's still angry and upset, but he's getting better. Now, 2 weeks ago, we looked at Job's search for God and for wisdom in chapters 27 and 28. Job is saying that he will never admit to his friends' accusations. They keep demanding that he admit that he's a wicked sinner and that he's done adultery and murder and thieving and all these things. He refuses to admit it, and he's right, because even though we're all sinners and we do many bad things, that doesn't mean you should admit to things that you didn't do, because that's a lie. So that's no good. Chapter 28, though, is an amazing chapter. We call it a hymn to wisdom. There are 2 hymns to wisdom in the Old Testament. One is Job 28, and the other is Proverbs chapter 8 by Solomon. They do have similarities, but they're also quite different. Job talks about mining and rocks and metallurgy, but what he's getting at is not mining per se. Mining has no direct application to Christianity, really. But what he's saying is that just like people search for hidden gems and gold and silver, so you should search for wisdom. But he tells you all the places you can't find wisdom. You can't find it in the cliffs, and you can't ask animals where it is or follow them on their migrations. You have to find it by relationship with God. It's the only way you find wisdom. Solomon says the same thing about wisdom. Job said that it's valuable above rubies and gold and topaz, and in Proverbs 8, 11, and 12, Solomon says exactly the same thing. So Solomon probably got some of his wisdom from Job. But Job asks, where can you find wisdom? It's hidden from everyone. You have to go to God. Only God knows its place. Now, without Job even knowing it, he is talking about Jesus, the Son of God. It's called personification. When you take an abstract concept and pretend like it's a human, as Job does and Solomon does about wisdom, that's called personification. And we're told that Jesus is the wisdom of God. He's the creator. And both Job and Solomon list all of the things he created, and so does John chapter 1. So Jesus is known as wisdom. But last week, we started Job's final speech, which is chapters 29 through 31. This is his legal finale. Job has decided his friends are done arguing. He's not going to listen to them anymore. He just demands that the judge cast judgment and that God is that judge. So these last chapters are Job demanding that God bring judgment. In chapter 29, Job explained what his life used to be like, how nice it was. Everyone respected him. He remembers the good old days. And his kids were alive, and everything he did prospered. When you think back on your life or the society we live in, when you think back, you often have what we call nostalgia. Nostalgia is remembering fondly the good old days. Now, the truth is, our minds can sometimes mask some of the problems we had in those good old days, and sometimes the good old days really weren't all that great. But you can look back just on the good things and be thankful to God for them. But what we're seeing now is that politically and culturally, we're in a time where there are no good old days. The good old days, in fact, were totally wicked and evil, and we should never go back to those days, and we should totally overthrow our systems and try something totally new. The American media, they're just acting like the devil's pawns, because the devil is the one who wants you to think that everything is always bad. The world is out of control, God is not in charge. The only way to grab some happiness from life is to take it for yourself and try new political systems and overthrow authority and all these sorts of things. So this is a tactic to discredit our current government and our national history so that they can replace it with something that they think is better. So I think that this shows that we're in a very dangerous time. But Job, he was called the greatest man of the East in the first part of the book. Everyone was respected. Everyone respected him, and we talked about how little respect we have now. Can you think of anyone in the government who has respect? For a while, even last week, I mentioned that Dr. Fauci, some people sort of respected him until this week when he appeared in Congress and said, well, I don't know if you can transmit the virus in protests, but you can sure spread it in churches. So now he's proven himself just to be another mouthpiece for some cause. But we just are in a time where there is no respect. And the reason there is no respect is, if you have respect for someone, it means you're admitting humility in your own heart, that there's someone better than you. And no one wants to admit that anyone's better than you. I mean, what have we raised in schools? People who think that you should have a participation trophy, and you can't have grades, because if you have grades, someone's better than you. So no one has respect anymore. We all have to be equal. At least that's the idea. Well, one of the main purposes of the book of Job is to teach God's people that we do not understand God or his plans for the world. Worldly wisdom and philosophies, these are what you got from Job's friends. And they weren't right. They even sort of pulled them out of the covenant of works, but they weren't right. And we are just foolish creatures in comparison to God. I mean, how is it that we can even think like God? We can't think of the future. We have no idea what's going to happen in the future. We just don't know. We can't remember very well what happened in the past. And as far as the present, we only have a tiny idea of what's going on around us. So really, what we know is very tiny compared to God. Because God can see the future and the past and the present in all of its permutations. The verse that's most important related to this is Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Okay? So we're not comparable to God in what we think. We have no clue what's going on. We like to pretend that we know what's going on because it makes us feel better. We feel more secure thinking we know. But the truth is, we don't know. We're just pretending to ourselves for security. Also, though, I talked about this in relation to Calvinism, because we Calvinists say that God does everything for his own glory. That does not mean that God does not care about us. In fact, this is a human tendency that psychologists call the zero-sum game, where we tend to think that if you have something good, that means I can't have something good, because there's a limited amount of good in the world. And so if you've got it, I can't have it. This is just the way our brains think for some reason. And it does work in some ways. I told you about the classic illustration of the cake. If it's true that the cake is all there is, and Mike's got half of it, then the most I could get out of it is half. But if there's more people who want some of the cake, and we have both halves, you get none. That's zero-sum game. All there is that cake. But the truth is that that doesn't work in economics or in social work, in any number of fields. You're usually wrong when you think that there's a limited amount of something, especially an abstract something. For example, in the 20th century, a lot of people were worried that everyone in the world was going to starve to death because the amount of grains or food you can grow out of the ground is limited by the amount of arable land and seeds and such. But we discovered new inventions such as fertilizer that allows you to grow 3 times more crops on the same amount of land. And then we discovered various ways of genetically engineering them to produce more. Whether that's good or not is another question, but it did feed the people. So the zero-sum game didn't work. We didn't all starve. In fact, God's plans for the world is not for everyone to die. God has good plans for the world. So my point is that when God is seeking his own glory, it does not mean that you get no good out of it. God has designed the universe so that when he gets glory, you get good things too. If you're one of God's beloved, if you love God, you participate in the happiness of his glory. So it's not like God is the great king and we're all his wormy minions on the ground and we give up everything we have to feed God. No, when he gets glory, we get goodness too. That's how he's designed the world. So don't let Arminians and others tell you that Calvinism seeks only the glory of God and so we mean nothing. That's not what it means. Every activity of God brings blessings to his people. Romans 8:28, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. How can everything work together for your good if God has got all the good and you don't get any? It's just not true. So the rub is, though, you have to love God. God's activities give him glory and bring good to those who love God. They do not bring good to those who do not love God. There is general good. We all get the sun and the rain and etc. But you don't get any specific goods for... Yes?
Creation, God created us in his likeness. Well, if he created us just to step on us, that just goes against what...
Yeah, God created us in his image, and he loves us, and so obviously he wants our good. If God didn't want our good, it would be harder to worship him. You'd be obligated to do it anyway, just because he's God, but that's not how he set it up. So now we continue to chapter 30. We did all of chapter 29, and we started chapter 30. The beginning of chapter 30 focuses, the first chapter, 29, of Job's final speech, he talked about how good life used to be. Now it's terrible. So now in this chapter, he's telling us just how unhappy he is. So more lament. And today we're in part 2 of the lament. But the key to the part of chapter 30 we looked at last week is verse 11. And that's because Job blames God for it. Job was complaining about how even homeless vagrants come by and spit on him and throw rocks at him. So even the vagrants don't like Job. He's so low. But then he says it's God's fault. God broke me, and so now the other people are willing to attack me too. So he's blaming God for his troubles. Actually, he's right, but blaming God is different than accepting what God has done. So we'll get to that. So let's continue now in chapter 30, verses 16 to 23. Now my soul is poured out because of my plight. The days of affliction take hold of me. My bones are pierced in me at night, and my gnawing pains have no rest. By great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about as the collar of my coat. He has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I stand up, and you regard me. But you have become cruel to me. With the strength of your hands you oppose me. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride on it. You spoil my success. I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living. So in the first verses of chapter 30, Job complains about his physical woes, or in these first verses. He talks about his bones hurting, and he has gnawing pains. It sounds like he's getting distorted and swelling so big that his garment is feeling tight on them. He talks about his garment being disfigured, and it binds him like a collar, like I'm wearing a tie. It's choking him. So that's how he talks at first, but then he complains about the emotional abuse as everyone disrespects him. Then he complains how God doesn't care and even treats him cruelly. So he's saying that God is the one being cruel to him. One particular intriguing word is in verse 21, where it says, you have become cruel to me, and with the strength of your hand you oppose me. That word oppose is the word satam, which is it's a derivative of Satan. Remember, Satan is Satan, the oppressor, the adversary. So God says, you have become a Satan to me. That's pretty bad. Now, whether Job actually knows that there is a Satan, he knows about a serpent, so he knows there's some bad guy in the world, but whether he's actually comparing God to the devil is a question we don't know. But it's certainly not a nice thing. God, you're opposing me. You're an oppressor, just like an evil one. I don't know for sure that that's true, but Job is definitely saying God has become my enemy. Now verses 24 to 31. Surely he would not stretch out his hand against a heap of ruins, if those cry out when he destroys it. Have I not wept for him who was in trouble? Has not my soul been grieved for the poor? But when I looked for good, evil came to me, and when I waited for light, then came darkness. My heart is in turmoil and cannot rest. Days of affliction confront me. I go about mourning, but not in the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry out for help. I am the brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin grows black and falls from me. My bones burn with fever. My harp is turned to mourning, and my flute to the voice of those who weep. So at the end of chapter 30, Job is really complaining. He's asking God, why was I a good man for all those years, and yet you bring me pain and destruction? Why do you attack me when I was good? Now that really is the question, isn't it? Why me? And that's the question we all ask when we have troubles. Why me? For Job, though, you see, a lot of people say that you get destroyed because you're wicked. And that is sometimes true, but it is not always true. For Job, it was not true. God is gaining glory and simultaneously improving Job's character in the crucible of adversity. In our trials, we seek God's help and we find God. And God uses that to remove the dross from our silver or gold. If you're not familiar with that term, if you go out in the mountains and you go find a rock that has gold in it, you can't just take it and spend it like gold because it's only partially gold. Even if it's really pure, you still have to put it in a furnace and melt it and get all the other stuff out and then make a bar or an ingot or a coin out of it for it to be pure gold. That's what God does with us with trials. We are never pure until we go to heaven. And so while we're not pure, God uses difficulties to get more good character out of us. And he gets more good character out of us by getting rid of bad character. So Job, though, he doesn't understand this, that we need difficulties to make us more like Christ. Job says, though, he says, I'm a brother of jackals and ostriches. Now, what does that mean? It's not just because he lives in the dump, because frankly, there probably aren't a lot of jackals and ostriches at the dump where he lives. Now, what he's talking about is the sounds of his cries. He's moaning and groaning and hissing because of his pain. And jackals, when they howl, they sound a lot like children screaming. It's kind of spooky if you listen to jackals cackling. And ostriches, when they make noises, they make this mournful hissing sound, kind of like a dove, only with a hiss in it. So what Job is saying is, I sound just like jackals and ostriches. You can see that the improvement in his mood isn't obvious right now. When we go now to the chapter 31, the last chapter, this is where Job swears he has not committed any big sins. And if you count them, there are actually 14 sins that Job says he never did in his oath to God. This is interesting in several ways. First of all, it's a lot like the book of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3. If you remember, God sends messages to 7 churches in Asia, and each of the 7 churches gets a warning and a praise and a threatened judgment. This chapter is a lot like that. As Christopher Ash points out in his book, every sin that Job lists here, first he says what the sin is. Then he says the judgment it deserves. Then he gives a reason why it's bad, and then he declares his innocence. So in some ways it's similar to the letters to the 7 churches. And this is how Job denies these sins. He says, I didn't do these. So let's start with verses 1 through 4. Chapter 31. I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? For what is the allotment of God from above, and the inheritance of Almighty from on high? Is it not destruction for the wicked, and disasters for the workers of iniquity? Does God not see my ways and count all my steps? So the first sin that Job denies is lust. He says he is not regularly lustful. He says he's made a covenant with his eyes not to stare at young women, because God sees his ways and counts his steps. The idea of sin coming through your eyes is very prominent in the Bible, and it's true. When you talk physiologically about a human body, for humans, the eyes are pretty much the most important thing we have. I mean, really they're not. It's really your brain, but we can't see our brain. The eyes are, we call it the windows to the soul. It's because what your brain learns is what you've seen, for the most part. You do have other senses, hearing and smell and touch, but eyes are the ones that you count on the most. I mean, just look at anyone's natural reflex. If you threaten to throw something at them, what do? Cover their face. You've got to protect your eyes, because eyes are very sensitive. You know what it's like if you get a piece of dirt or something stuck in there, you're going crazy. You're trying to find a mirror and wash out whatever it is. So the eyes are very important. Just think of all the sins that came through the eyes in the Bible, almost all of them. The very first sin of humans in Genesis chapter 3, we're told that Eve saw how lovely the fruit was, and so she took it and ate it. So it wasn't just that Satan tempted her, it looked good. So she was tempted by her eyes. And in 2 Samuel, David was out wandering on his palace and looked down on the city and saw a beautiful naked woman bathing on her roof, and he lusted after her, and what did that lead to? Adultery and murder. So those were both from the eyes. And then Jesus says that if you look lustfully at a woman, it's adultery. It's the same kind of sin. So the eyes are the major way that you sin. And it's not just in men, but it's also in women. So Job says, I have not been lustful. I've controlled my eyes. Now verses 5 through 8. If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity. If my step has turned from the way, or my heart walked after my eyes, or if any spot adheres to my hands, then let me sow and another eat. Yes, let my harvest be rooted out. So here Job denies that he has been false or deceitful. Now the positive side of that, those are the negatives, is that he lives with integrity. He doesn't turn from the right way. He's kept his steps. It sounds like Psalm 1. You know, he doesn't stand in the way of the wicked or walk in the way of sinners and sit in the seat of scoffers. This thing he asks God to do, weigh me in the scales, this is a prominent allusion in all societies throughout history. It goes back to ancient times. You know what a scale is? Even the symbol on courts. You ever seen the scales on court buildings? A scale, a hanging scale, is one of the most ancient ways to prove value of something. In other words, if you go to the marketplace, this is before money. You go to the marketplace and you've got some gold or some silver or just some potatoes. You put them on the scale and then they put some weights on there and they can tell you, okay, you got 5 pounds worth of potatoes here. I'll give you so much money for it. Scales is how you weigh gold too. If you've got a tiny bit of gold and put it on there, then they weigh it. You've got value. Scales is how you decide what the value of something is. Being weighed in the scales is a symbol of justice too. Equality. You want there to be punishment that is equal to the crime. This is one reason why modern Americans are sort of offended by some of Islam's laws, because in Islamic law, under Sharia law, if you're caught stealing, they cut off your hands. That's not a really equitable system of justice. In the Bible, if you got caught stealing something, you had to make restitution. You didn't lose your hands. So there are some laws that are just unjust. But one of the most famous Bible stories about weighing something in the scales, can you remember what's the most famous story about being weighed in the scales? It's in the book of Daniel. In chapter 5, when King Belshazzar is having his orgy using the temple goblets and they bring in Daniel, the hand wrote on the wall, Daniel said, what it says on the wall is, you have been weighed in the scales and are found wanting. God weighed you and you're not worth anything, so you're going to die tonight. That was the most obvious use of scales in the Bible. Okay, so now we go on to verses 9 through 12. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. For that would be wickedness. Yes, it would be iniquity deserving of judgment. That would be a fire that consumes to destruction and would root out all my increase. So not only does Job avoid lustfully looking at women, he also has certainly never acted badly upon that and committed adultery. He swears and he vows that he would let other men take his wife if he was guilty of such wickedness. Now Job uses other words here that are more strong than other sins. He calls adultery a heinous crime, worthy of serious punishment. So it's not just a little thing, it's a big thing. Now verses 13 through 15. If I have despised the cause of my male or female servant when they complained against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he punishes, how shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb? So, fourth thing Job says is, I am not guilty of ignoring the complaints of my servants, either male or female. As a reason, it seems that Job knows by creation that both master and servants are both humans. In other words, he never believed that his servants were less than human, like some southern slave owners in the Civil War believed they were not fully human. In fact, the Constitution, as originally written, said that slaves are two-thirds of a human, as far as voting purposes go. Two-thirds human. But Job, even by nature, knows that's wrong. And he says it because God made them and God made me. It's not like the devil made those other people. The devil never made anybody. God made everybody. So Job knows just from creation that slaves are his equals, at least in the form of creation. So he said, oh, by the way, also, I want you to notice that servants in the Bible are not slaves like they were here in the United States. The servants or slaves, as they're called in the Bible, were voluntary slaves. In other words, they borrowed money but then couldn't pay it back. And so in order to pay it back, they agree to work for a couple of years to work off their debt. So it's not like they're in chains or anything like that. They are voluntary servants, not kidnapped slaves. Now verses 16 to 23. If I have kept the poor from their desire, or caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or eaten my morsel by myself, while the fatherless could not eat of it, but from my youth I reared him as a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have ever seen someone perish for lack of clothing, or any poor man without a covering, if his heart has not blessed me, and if he was not warmed from the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, when I saw I had help in the gate, then let my arm fall from my shoulder, let my arm be torn from its socket, for destruction from God would be a terror to me. Because of his magnificence I cannot endure. So in these verses, Job says, I have never harmed poor people. And not only did I not harm them, I did them good. I gave them clothing and I gave them food, and some of them I even raised in my own home. Now that last verse sounds bad, but it does not mean that Job has always been terrified of God. What he's saying, it's a conditional. He's saying, I would be terrified of God if I was guilty of these things. If I was harming the poor and stealing from the widows, I would be very terrified of God. Now, God is especially interested in generosity to the poor because God usually uses people to be his ministers on earth. You know, God could send angels to help the poor, or he could just do miracles to make the poor suddenly rich. But that's not how God gets glory. God gets more glory by changing people and people helping them. It shows how we are different, and it's an example of why they should come to Christ also. You might also imagine that God is very displeased when the poor are manipulated by people who seek power. If a political party exploits the poor by promising them goodies for their votes, or pretends to befriend minorities to increase their own political power, God knows that. God is not blind to that evil. The levels of pandering, they always go up in election years, and those who are guilty of it are going to regret it because God hates the manipulation of the poor for your own selfish reasons. Now verses 24 through 28. If I have made gold my hope, or said to fine gold, you are my confidence, if I have rejoiced because my wealth was great, and because my hand gained so much, if I observed the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in its brightness, so that my heart has been enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand, this would be an iniquity deserving of judgment, for I would have denied God who is above. This is really interesting here, because Job is saying that he worships no false gods. And the two examples of false gods that Job gives are money and astronomical bodies. In other words, if you have trust in your money, that is your God. If you think that the reason your life is good is because you've got money, you worship your money. The only reason you should feel that your life is good is because God has made your life good. The other example he gives is of the sun and the moon. That's astrology. If you think that because the sun is so bright and gives us so much warmth and etc., that it's God, then you're worshiping the wrong God. And if you think that your horoscopes, that the moon in its certain phases and the stars in a certain way makes you the way you are, you seem to think that the stars are in control of your life. And they're not. God is in control of your life. So these are just two examples that are normal for idolatry. If you think that anything is your confidence that's not God, that's idolatry. The thing you spend the most time thinking about is probably your idol. So Job says, I've never had an idol. I've always worshiped God. Now verses 29 to 32. If I have rejoiced at the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted myself up when evil found him, indeed I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for a curse on his soul. If the men of my tent have not said, who is there who has not been satisfied with his meat? But no sojourner had to lodge in the street, for I opened my doors to the traveler. Here Job talks about two different sins he's not committed. One is he has never wished revenge on his enemies or curses. In fact, he never took secret pleasure when bad things happened to his enemies. Now that's even harder. You know, you might tell yourself that I have an enemy. And let's say that I cursed that enemy. That's bad. But even if I never cursed my enemy, if I found out that my enemy got really hurt and I thought, serves him right, good karma. All of these are ways of saying you're grateful that your enemy was punished. That's not really a good thing. In fact, the Old Testament and the New Testament both say that if you think that way, God may relent in his judgment on the enemy because you've enjoyed it too much. God doesn't want you to enjoy the deaths of your enemies. There are exceptions, and that's what we call the imprecatory Psalms. In the imprecatory Psalms, the people of God praised God for destroying their enemies. And that was right, because they were God's enemies, not because they were your enemies. There's a difference there. You can be glad when some tyrant like Stalin dies, because he was an enemy of God as well as an enemy of the people. But being glad about it because you personally hated Stalin is not right. So that's the difference. But the other thing he says is that he never made travelers sleep in the street. He always gave shelter to travelers. So this was an Old Testament custom, especially in arid desert lands where there weren't motels. So you either slept out under the stars in your tent with wild animals around you, or you found some guy's house and asked if you could stay there. Even if he didn't feed you and clothe you, at least you could pitch your tent in a fairly safe place where the animals don't come. So Job says, I never made the travelers sleep in the streets. Okay, now verses 33 through 34. If I have covered my transgressions like Adam, by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, because I feared the great multitude and dreaded the contempt of families, so that I kept silence and did not go out of the door. Here Job says, I have never hidden my sins. Now some of your translations may have a different idea. Some translations say they exchange Adam for men. So your translation might say, if I hid my transgressions like men, instead of like Adam. Does anyone here have a translation that uses men? Okay, you've got men. What version do you have? NIV. Okay, they changed it to men. The reason that, you see, the word Adam means man. That's just what it means. And so what some scholars have said, they don't think that Adam applies very well here, so they think God was saying general man. I have not hidden my transgressions like most men do. That's why they've changed it to men. But literally it says Adam, and so I actually believe that it is the regular Adam. Remember, when Adam and Eve sinned, what did they do? What's the very first thing they did? They hid among the trees. And then they tried to sew fig leaves together to cover their private parts. So they were hiding from God. And so I think it's pretty obvious that that's what Job means here. I have not hidden my sins from you like Adam did. And remember that Job says he didn't hide in his home. He had no reason to not go out in public. He wasn't ashamed to go out in public because he was a good man and no one had anything against him. Now verses 35 to 37. Oh, that I had one to hear me. This is my mark. Oh, that the Almighty would answer me, that my prosecutor had written a book. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder and bind it on me like a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps. Like a prince I would approach him. Now Job, he hasn't quite finished with the list of his sins that he didn't do yet. He's got one more. But here he makes his final sworn statement. When it says, here is my mark, if you're old enough, you probably remember people used to say, make your mark here. It just means sign here. Making your mark is signing. Now, it often, though, implied, if someone said you can make your mark, it meant that they thought you were illiterate and you couldn't actually write out your name. And if that was the case, when many people were illiterate, they just made a mark, like an X or a funny little symbol that meant, that's me. That's making your mark. But Job was saying, here's my signature. I've sworn all of these things are true, and I want God to take my final contract and judge me. And in fact, he says that if God or a prosecutor had made a book of all my sins, I would happily carry it to God so that he could look at it. Because he is so confident that he is a righteous man that he thinks God will see the book and know that he is righteous. So he demands an immediate, God, make your verdict. That's a little dangerous, by the way. Because as Paul says, if you have sinned in any one pieces of the law, you've sinned against them all. But Job doesn't know that yet. He's early in history. Now the final verses are verses 38 to 40. If my land cries out against me, and its furrows weep together, if I have eaten its fruit without money, or caused its owners to lose their lives, then let thistles grow instead of wheat, and wheat instead of barley. And the words of Job are ended. Now, a lot of scholars, this last sin is very unusual and it's controversial among scholars. They say, obviously, this text has been corrupted. Because why would you sign your signature at the end of the paper and then, oh yeah, there's one more sin I didn't do? So they think that this is all a big mistake and that some copyist wrote the last part of Job's story down and then he remembered, oh, I forgot about the land. I should have put it up there, but rather than erase it or write out or whatever they used to do on papyrus, they'd probably have to tear a sheet off and glue another sheet on. But instead of doing that, he just added it on at the end. And it's obvious why, because it doesn't seem to fit. Right? Well, I think it does fit. I don't think it's a mistake, and here's why. What sin is Job denying at the end? Crimes against the land. Now, this is a controversial topic in the modern church, and that's because of the environmentalist movement. There are extremists on both sides. Extreme conservatives seem to think that the land was given to man by God with no strings attached, and we can do whatever we want with it. That's what we call laissez-faire capitalism, and it's wrong. God did not say we can do anything we want with the land. But then on the other hand, there's the ultra-liberal views where the earth is a biological goddess and we should worship her and return to a Stone Age gathering society and cut the earth's population to 100 million people so that we can save the planet. Okay, that's the Hillary Clinton view. She's a member of Population Growth Zero, which is a group that says we should release diseases like the bubonic plague. I guess they love COVID virus. We should purposely release diseases to kill off as many as we can to save the planet. So those are the two extreme views. But both views are wrong, and that's because God laid out standards for the treatment of the land and the animals. You know, there were supposed to be Sabbath rests for the land and for the fields every 7 years so that the animals and the poor could glean from it. The Mosaic law said that even in war, you cannot cut down the trees of the enemy, because the trees are not your enemy and you should not attack the land. So this whole method of destruction started in the Civil War. Sherman's march across the South, where he burned and destroyed everything in his path. It was supposed to force the Confederacy to surrender, and it really did. But that was crimes against the land, which were never allowed in the Bible, those sort of things. But these things alone do not explain why Job brought it up last, does it? No, but I think there is a good reason it came after the vow. Turn back in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 3. We already talked about Adam and Eve sinning. Now let's look about what God says about their sins. In Job chapter 3, you remember Job just said, I'm not like Adam, I didn't try to hide my sin. So in verse 14, the Lord curses the serpent, and he says, you're going to go on your belly for the rest of your life. And this is the proto-evangelion in verse 15, which means the first gospel, where it says, between your seed and her seed, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. This is God's promise to destroy the serpent. Then in verse 16, to the woman he said, and he basically says you're going to have lots of pain now when you bear children. But the most important part is verse 17 through 19. God curses Adam last. And what is the curse on Adam? Then Adam said to him, because you have heeded the voice of your wife. Now, I'm getting married soon, so I'm not going to discuss that part. Listening to the voice of your wife, we'll just leave that one there. In toil you shall, and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying you should not eat. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it will bring forth for you, and you will eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. So, the curse of God on Adam is actually manifested by a curse on the ground, the soil. He says to Adam, all of your labor, all of your trying to grow things, you're going to produce what? Thorns and thistles, and your work's going to be a lot harder. And how long will this state of affairs last? Until Adam returns to the ground, because dust you are, and to dust you shall return. So God's curse on Adam was to make the ground bear thistles and thorns. Now, does that dust to dust remind you of anything from the book of Job? It's not identical, but it is very similar to Job 121. If you remember, when Job was first struck with all his disasters, what did he say? Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I think he was kind of alluding to the curse on Adam. He knows that from dust he was made, and to dust he will return. And if you remember, he and his friends were throwing dirt on themselves. That tradition is believed to be a symbol of saying, I'm dust, covering myself with dust. This is all I am anyway. So I think the reason that Job puts this little thing at the end of his speech is because he's asking God to bring down the curses on Job, just as he did to Adam, if he deserves that. God, if I have been wicked, if I have been hiding these sins from you, then you should treat me just like you treated Job, and you should fill my land with thistles and thorns. So I don't think it's out of place. I think it's exactly where Job meant to say that. You promised Adam he would return to dust, and I know I will return to dust. But God never abandoned Adam and Eve. And so Job is saying, even after their sins, you still let them live, and you gave them children. So I think Job is saying, I still have hope, because you gave Adam and Eve hope, you can give me hope too. And in fact, if you think about it, the justice of God is better than random chance from a godless world. Evolutionists and atheists and agnostics believe that the only reason they're alive is because of random chance. A cell bounded with a cell and bonded with another cell and became a protoplasm and became a frog and became a fish and became a monkey and became a man. All random chance. The only reason I'm here. And the only reason you live every day is just random chance. It's better, as Job knew, to rely on the justice of God than to rely on random chance. Even if God seems to be against Job, Job still prefers the justice of God. His wife told him to curse God and die, and Job came really close to it, perilously close, but he persevered. The perseverance of the saints, that doctrine is that godly people will never die rejecting God, because the Holy Spirit will keep them from abandoning hope in God. What that means is, if you ever do abandon and reject God, it means you never were saved, you never did have the Holy Spirit. Now, we disagree with Job's friends that punishments and rewards from God are instantaneous, as if God is like a genie in the bottle, or an unintelligent force, and if you rub him this way, he'll make you rich, and if you rub him this way, he'll make you poor. That's not what we believe. That's the health and wealth gospel. But God does make threats and promises, bad and good, for your life on the land, to the wicked and to the righteous. All through the Bible, through the Mosaic Law, through the prophets, in Solomon's prayers, you repeatedly see that God promises blessings on the land to those who are righteous and curses on the land to those who are wicked. It's just like God gave Adam harder work by bringing weeds. God threatens groups with famine and blight and wild beasts if they fail to keep the covenant. God promises plenty and health to those who keep the covenant. So what I'm getting at is that there are great blessings for the righteous and there are great curses on the wicked. But what we disagree with Job's friends on is their skewed views. And I think what it comes down to is their individualistic views on blessings and cursings. The health and wealth gospel is the result of a formulaic understanding of God's justice at the individual level. They think that all of these blessings and curses come on you personally, Mike Bibby, because he's evil or good. That's not what the promises meant. The promises in the Bible, in the prophets, in Solomon's prayers were to whom? To the people, as a group, not as an individual. So it's not you've got the bottle and you rub the genie and you get what you want. No, it's the group is good to God and righteous with God. They get blessings. You see, the more general interpretation of God's blessings or curses is on groups. And this makes the history of nations much easier to understand. Let's talk about the rise and fall of ancient empires. You know, empires rise and fall either because God supports them or God removes his support from them. That's how empires survive. But then you might say, well, but what about Assyria and Babylon? Assyria and Babylon were wicked empires, and God never would bless them, would he? No, you're absolutely right. They were wicked empires. He didn't bless them. Well, then you say, well, why did they rise and become so powerful? Well, the problem is you're thinking wrongly that God was blessing Assyria or Babylon. He had no interest in evil empires. No, what was his purpose? His purpose of raising Assyria and Babylon was to punish who? His people for disobedience. The Assyrians, who did they punish? The 10 northern tribes who for hundreds of years ignored Elijah and Elisha and all the prophets and worshiped Baals and did orgy worship in their worship of Baals. God sent the Assyrians to annihilate them, and the last few people they drug away in chains, never to be heard from again. It had nothing to do with God blessing Assyria. God wanted to use somebody to wipe out the Jews, the Israelites. Babylon. Babylon was never righteous either. Nebuchadnezzar, he might have become a believer toward the end of his life, but he was a wicked man most of his life. God didn't bring Babylon along to bless them because they were good. He brought them along to carry his people into captivity for a limited time, 70 years. And in Ezekiel says the reason God, or maybe it was Jeremiah, I always forget which one it was, but one of the prophets said, you are going away into captivity because you never gave your land a Sabbath. So you will be gone 70 years to make up for all the Sabbaths you never gave the land. So anyway, so empires rise and fall, not because they are particularly righteous or evil, but because God uses them to judge or bless his people. So if his people have a good influence on a nation, that nation will often be blessed because his people are in it and deserve the temporal blessings. But when his people become wicked and require judgment, then God sends big judgments upon that nation and may even destroy it. So the blessings of Western civilization on earth were not because England or the United States were righteous nations, but because the churches within those countries had godly principles upon which the government was based, justice being probably the main one. God's blessing on Abraham, God promised that his descendants would bless the whole world. And it's in Christianity that they finally did that. The Jews never really spread their religion much. But under Christ, the blessings of Christianity have spread across the world. And that's why we had the blessings of Western civilization and technologies and such things. It is true that God does individually bless us, but it's not so much in physical goodies, it's in spiritual blessings. He gives us a clean conscience and enlightenment from the Holy Spirit and generosity to help others, etc. But groups gain more temporal blessings by being a good influence on their country. That is God's people. So you cheat yourself of some of the blessings of the covenant if you're not a part of a church. Because you get blessings on your own from the Holy Spirit, but you get other blessings by being a part of the church, just as we get other blessings by being a part of a nation. So being a part of the church is an important thing. It didn't exist at the time of Job yet, because God has not yet brought Israel to himself. Okay, so that's all for today. Do you have any questions about all of this? We've still got about 10 minutes. Yes.
I see all through the Old Testament where God is using the wicked to try his people. You know, it's just the way that he uses them. He'll raise up armies, and that's the other prophets, just one after another, raising up armies to strike down Israel, and then he punishes those armies for doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the funny or satirical things to think about. God raises up Babylon to destroy the Jews, and then he raises up Persia to destroy Babylon because God was angry at what Babylon did to the Jews, even though what Babylon did to the Jews was exactly what God wanted him to do. So, because the Babylonians didn't do it because of God. I mean, they did it because they were wicked and selfish and wanted to kill people. So, yes, it is interesting. Just as God uses good people to bless other people, God uses evil people to curse other people. And so right now we are in a judgment of God, receiving the curses of many wicked people in some of our big cities.
Yeah. God is like in Nineveh, forgave the wicked people because they repented.
Yes, there's always a chance for repentance. As Jonah, the book of Jonah showed, God used Jonah to bring a revival to Nineveh, and it spared the city for a couple more generations. That was Assyria. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. Did you have a question, Mark?
So Job, yeah, in Job's appeal, it's not like he's saying, like, I tried my best. Like, I mean, that's not what, to me, it'd be like maybe not a correct way of looking at it. Where he's like, well, I tried my best. I really tried my hardest not to be these things. I mean, that's not what he's saying.
No, because Job made sacrifices for the things he did commit. Now, he is in this last chapter listing all of the terrible sins he did not do. So he didn't commit adultery and he didn't commit this and that. Although you kind of wonder, is it true? Is it possible for a man never to look lustfully on a woman? What about when he was a teenager? I don't know. But he is not saying that he has been perfect, but he is saying, I've not done any of the big sins that deserve these judgments. He's basically accusing God of being unjust because God has punished him so, as if he had committed these sins. So I think that's why Elihu's going to come along here next week and challenge Job.
But he's not even claiming he did that under his own power. Like, well, I did this, so what can I say? Like, God, you had it. I mean, it just seems like it's, if you can look at it that way, he's saying, I tried my hardest, so I did my part. Like, I just think that's a mistake.
Yes, Job is mistaken. He's mistaken about a lot of things, and that's why God's going to send Elihu to rebuke him. We'll start with that next week, the Elihu speeches. So Job does kind of sound like a Pharisee here. I didn't do this, and I didn't do that, and I didn't do that, so I'm righteous. If you look at the law from the point of view of things I didn't do, it still doesn't make you righteous. It doesn't necessarily mean that he did everything good, although he does say, I help the poor and I help the widows. So he does seem to be relying on his own righteousness to some degree. I would be afraid to take that prosecutor book to God. He says, I'll carry it like a prince to God. I don't think he fully understands the mediator. He has talked about a mediator. So, but it doesn't sound like he totally understands it, and how could he? Because God never told him.
Yeah, I need to look at it more carefully. But it's like, what we just went over, is he alluding to the mediator and saying, the mediator, I have a mediator? Are we in a part here where Job's acknowledging the mediator as like the only solution, or I have a mediator because that's the only answer?
I think he did that in chapter 19 under the power of the Holy Spirit. But ever since then, maybe once in chapter 23 he also said something like that. But for the most part, he's not talking. He's saying he wishes he had a mediator. But it's a good question. Is Job relying too much on his righteousness? I think he is, but it's possible he isn't. Maybe he is saying that the mediator covers my sins, but it doesn't sound like it, because it still sounds like he wants to be judged by the book of offenses that he assumes the prosecutor's been keeping. So maybe in the back of his mind he has this idea of a mediator, but I don't think it's fully worked itself out for him yet. So it's a good question, though. It's a difficult thing. So this is the end of Job's words, except for 2 or 3 sentences later. So next week we will start talking about Elihu, who is kind of an enigma. And he goes for several chapters, and then God speaks. So the last two speakers are Elihu and God. Okay, so let's, would you close us in prayer, Dave? You close us in prayer?